Right, off we go. I'm just projecting, so those of you in the back row, listen up. But if I really do dip too much, do wave a hand and we'll sort something. Right, May 22nd, 1813, famous for a couple of reasons. One, Richard Wagner was born on that day. But the real one is it was the first night of L'Italiana in Algeri, the Italian girl in Algiers, composed by 21-year-old Rossini, who'd already written 10 shows. He knocked it off in about 3 weeks. And I mention this because someone's bound to tell you that. And there's a tendency to cope with Rossini's irritating success and actual panache by saying, oh, of course, he only took a fortnight. As though that somehow diminishes it. It actually, of course, makes it even more wonderful. And for the early 19th century, Rossini was opera. Young composers discovered they had to imitate him or go under. Italians appeared to know his operas off by heart, and I've always been impressed the way Neapolitans apparently sung his arias in the street. When you hear how many notes there are in his arias, this shows the Neapolitans are a naturally gifted race. His shows appeared everywhere. They even got to England relatively soon. It usually took about 20 to 30 years for things to get across the channel. And we were discovering Mozart about 1815, round about the time we were discovering Rossini. So he managed to get across the channel as much quicker than Mozart. And over in Paris, which is usually a bastion of, like we do French opera, we don't do anything else, they had an Italian opera house solely devoted at one point to Rossini's operas, and round which the young Berlioz used to prowl, trying to work out how to blow it up. So we're talking fame, and you don't get this famous for being a charlatan. There's loads and loads of Rossini stories about him writing an aria and it dropping off the bed, and you're thinking, oh, I can't be bothered to get out of bed and writing another aria, you know, that stuff. I don't believe it. His pieces are, of course, comic, or the ones that tend to get played are the comic ones, buoyant, irrepressibly cheerful, drive people mad, and yet thoroughly professional. And we get constant criticism. I work at the Royal Opera House whenever we put on some frivolous piece. And Barbara Seville is allowed, but you put on Il Turco in Italia and they all go crackers. And it's as though everything we do has to be Tristan. Well, fortunately, in 1813, Tristan was some way ahead, so nobody wasn't too bothered about that. But it's extremely difficult to do comedy, as I'm sure we all know, especially if you want to hold the audience's attention for a couple of hours and be brilliant and keep a light touch. Rossini did it by being a consummate master of his art. And the genre in which he worked was, of course, as I'm sure everybody could tell me, bel canto, fine singing. Flourished at the end of the 18th century right through to the middle of the 19th, and then louder instruments and denser orchestration started demanding heavier voices, so something of that bel canto, that fine singing, was lost. It was predominantly an Italian phenomenon. I believe other nations can sing beautifully, but it was understood that real opera was composed and sung by Italians, and this was particularly true once Rossini started to call the shots. And his great contribution to the opera of his day was to revitalise the forms inherited from the 18th century and make them doable for his contemporaries. And he did this by producing, I don't think he meant to, but he produced a template for an effective show. It was called the Rossini Code. And so anyone who wants to write a Rossini opera, I shall now tell you how to do it. Its basic building block is the solo aria, introduced by a recitative and followed by 3 sections. A lyrical first movement, gets you used to the sound of the singer, gets you into the mood, warm up the singer perhaps. It's the cantabile. And then it's interrupted by a tolling bell perhaps, an offstage horn. One marvellous aria has Vesuvius erupting, that's quite an interruption. The sudden appearance of the chorus is usually quite sufficient. But anyway, the interruption brisks things up. A decision has to be made, something has to be reacted to, and you get a cabaletta. the last section. And this is stimulated by the interruption, of course, goes at a good pace normally, offers a singer a chance to show off his or her vocal ability. And we're going to hear this basic pattern in the first aria of Italiana, the entrance aria. But before we do it, an entrance aria sounds as though it should come just shortly after the overture, but actually entrance arias for the prima donna come 20 minutes into the show. You can set your watch by the prima donna. She had a 20-minute lead-in, the orchestra was warmed up, the latecomers were settled, the audience were ready to applaud the first showstopper of the piece, and people timed their supper round this aria. So you mustn't think the Italian audience necessarily sat through the whole opera. Oh, we're late for the overture, forget it. I mean, these shows were on for 10 or 30 performances at a time. Now, you went to the opera house every night. It was practically the only thing you could do in early 19th century Italy. It was such a repressive regime that all sorts of things that we take for granted, like having dinner with your friends, were frowned upon by the government. So when the opera house was open, the Italians would just say to each other, "See you at the opera tonight." And they would go for the first couple of shows to listen to the opera, to see what they were going to have to put up with for the next month, and to be very, very vocal if they thought, that is it, take it off now, we've got a month of this. But once the show was on its way, they'd go to the opera house to gamble, and to flirt, and to have their supper, and to watch the show, up to a point. But they'd want to be there for that aria di sortita, the entrance aria. And once Donizetti changed the timing of the prima donna's aria, he got into unbelievable trouble. So here we are, practically 20 minutes in, well, 8 minutes in, and we're going to hear the opening aria. By the time we hear it, we know already that we're in Algiers, and we've met the ruler of Algiers, the Bey, and his unfortunate wife, Elvira. As this is 1805, that's when the show is notionally set, we're not going to be politically correct here. This is a Muslim country, and what we meet is a comic Turk, which means he's absurd, lecherous, and very dangerous indeed. And he's sung by the comic bass, the buffo. Cross the Bey for a second, and you're threatened with impalement. But, of course, this is a comic opera, so nothing's going to happen. So just think yourself into Mikado, and you'll feel quite safe. And the Bey is bored with his compliant wife and his dreary harem, and he's decided to marry off one of his Italian slaves, Lindoro, to his sort of chief wife, Elvira. The moment an Italian audience would have heard the name Lindoro, if they hadn't actually already looked at the cast sheet, they thought, "Oh, Lindoro, where is he?" Oh yeah, young tenor, obviously the hero. And that suspicion would have been immediately resolved by Lindoro getting up to sing his first aria, which comes before the prima donna, tenors not having that rating in those days so much. And tenors sing, especially their first aria, will often be long, flowing, passionate lines about their lover. Any tenor can do this, great, long, wonderful lines. You'll get it in Verdi opera, Rossini opera. Apart from Pinkerton, you can trust a tenor. He's sincere. And you need to know this. You need to know there's one guy in this show who's got a heart, really does love the girl whenever she appears, well, in 20 minutes' time. And the emotional heart of the opera is set. There's the tenor, nice bloke. So he'll have done that and convinced us of his sincerity. And the Bey has ordered his men to sink a ship and find him another wife, a beautiful Italian girl. And it doesn't come as a complete surprise to find the second scene is set on a seashore with a wrecked ship upstage and a beautiful young woman picking her way over the wreckage to come downstage. And I'll never forget watching this show in a stage rehearsal at the English National Opera centuries ago, early 80s, when we'd lost the leading lady. And another singer, a very fine singer indeed, had been flown in. And she came on the back of the stage. There was the wreckage. And she marched over the wreckage and came straight down the centre of the stage. No, 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 said the director, no. You sing the opening part of the aria on the ship. Do you know who I am? Said the singer. I am the star who has flown in and saved the show. I'm singing this centre stage down the front. Which she did, of course. Anyway, not surprisingly, our heroine laments her fate, cruda sorte, and she puts her cruel fate down to the tyrant's love, because, lo, this is Isabella, our heroine, who has been roaming the seas in search of her lost love. Who could that be? Lindoro. What a coincidence. So there you are, the measured, stately opening of an entrance aria. And she's interrupted, inevitably, by the slaves of the bay, delighted to find an Italian girl so easily. And when she realises she's about to be captured, she switches gear. She's not actually terribly disconcerted by the appearance of the male chorus, or her capture, or her prospects as a slave, because she's an Italian woman. She's beautiful, she knows how to cope with men, and more than anything else, she's a mezzo-soprano. This is the awful moment. They do this at the proms. You've just sung yourself to pieces, and somebody pumps up with a mic and asks you to talk to the nation about how you feel.
It's like doing sit-ups.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So that, as we all know, was coloratura, and that means lots of notes. Tell me about those notes. How do you do it?
They involve, first, a lot of slow practice.
Okay.
Just to get each one exactly in its place slowly.
Okay.
So a bit like you would do on an instrument. So practice slowly, work the tempo up. And then when you've got the tempo up, is finding the perfect balance between supporting it and letting go so that the notes can move. Because if you're too tense, then it becomes rigid and they won't move.
Okay.
But if you're not tense enough, then they also won't come out right. So it's a very delicate balance.
Such is your skill. Goodness me. Have you sung in this rep before?
I've not sung this role before.
Okay.
But I've sung Cenerentola,
Ah.
and bits of Barbara of Seville as well, but not the whole thing yet.
Okay. And does Isabella feel different to Angelina?
Yeah. It does. The tessitura is different. It
Okay.
sits a bit lower. The character is quite different as well. And I find with Isabella there's obviously much more comedy. And there are many more words. So, whereas Angelina in the ensemble, she tends to do sort of a lot of coloratura over everybody else doing the words.
Okay.
Isabella joins right in and patters like the rest of them.
I see. So you've not only got all those notes, you've got all this text.
Yes.
Oh,
yes. So indeed, there are some ensembles where the notes are not the great concern. The words are the great concern because there are so many and they go so quickly.
And does Rossini sit well for you?
Yes.
Oh,
I quite like singing Rossini. I find it fits very well. It feels very comfortable. I'm quite fond of singing the fast notes.
Really?
Which some might consider a bit bad, but I do quite like it.
It suits your range, your voice.
Yeah, it feels quite comfortable. Plus, I quite like in Rossini the sort of unwritten performance practice. So you'll see this more in the second aria, but there's lots of room for ornamentation and sort of changing things and kind of making it your own, and which I quite like. Okay,
we'll look forward to that. Nick, can I quickly talk to you? I mean, if we're doing strange stylistic things, and in other words, she's shoving in more notes, isn't she? Do you have to work that out with the singers, or do you just watch them go?
Yes. Because sometimes, because they may vary away from what's printed in the copy. So sometimes it's just a question of negotiating, maybe just giving them a little bit more time just to fit those notes in. But on the whole, trying to keep the general shape of the music. And
all these words, then presumably it's like recitative. You've got to get the rhythm of speech in somehow. Is that your job to get those passages happening? Perhaps it's David's job. I don't know.
Absolutely my job.
Is it?
Not sounding weary here, I hope.
He's slumped. We'll wake him up at the end.
They're very good at telling us when we are saying things wrong and helping us out with languages, and sometimes it doesn't sound quite Italian, or if it's a German. The reps are wonderful for helping us out with with getting the quality of the language.
Yes.
And
we also have an Italian coach as well during rehearsals who helps out with, who's there, keeping an eye on the language all the time.
Yeah.
So.
And sometimes it's just a matter of a vowel sound which isn't quite right, and it might sound right to the singer inside their head, but outside the room it doesn't sound right. And so someone like me can say, you might want to just brighten the R there a little bit, and it really affects what's coming out in the room.
So it's the words, the notes, and brighten up that R.
Yes.
Oh, it's a cinch, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, back to the plot, which isn't as improbable as it sounds, really. I'm not saying Italiana is a realistic opera, but the setup is based on what was really going on in the Mediterranean in 1813. Rossini wrote this opera for the Teatro San Benedetto in Venice, where no Venetian would have thought there was anything particularly unlikely about Lindoro or Isabella's predicament. The Mediterranean nations had been coping with Barbary pirates for centuries. Nobody lived by the Spanish coast. Tourists were warned not to walk on the beaches. Merchant ships only left port in armed convoys. Single ships draped themselves in black and sailed cautiously at night. And in spite of all precautions, pirate vessels still carried off prizes to Tunis, Tripoli, and the queen of pirate cities, Algiers. The people in Algiers, of course, would have indignantly rejected this title. They were corsairs, they'd have said. They're privateers, licensed by what bay there was to fit out a ship and fight his enemies, or rather cruise the Mediterranean and capture slaves. There was a flourishing slave market in every Barbary town and a very fine income to be made out of ransoms. You get over and over again, you get reports of English tourists meeting unfortunate Isabellas and Lindoros in North African and sort of Near Eastern cities. The conflict in which the corsairs were notionally engaged was the eternal war between the Muslim and the Christian. And when the USA impatiently disclaimed the honour of being a Christian nation, they changed the nature of the war and said it was between the Muslim and the infidel, which gave the Barbary states a lot of scope. And in fact, once they'd mastered the Straits of Gibraltar, they conducted successful raids as far as Ireland and Iceland, and one amazing lucrative season down the English Channel. They bagged a whole Cornish village who were coming out of church one Sunday morning. So this is the stuff behind Italiana. And although the Americans eventually put an end to the whole business in the 1830s, until then, Western hostages were just to be found all over the Near East. And as this is 1813, Isabella's very brave, if not reckless, to be travelling around looking for her lover in her little ship, now wrecked. But she is provided with a baritone, and which is always reassuring. An elderly admirer, Taddeo, who's rather restive at Isabella's total lack of interest in him. And as she finishes her aria, they have a duet in which they scrap and then make it up. Obviously, with all these Turks around, they'd better stick together. So Taddeo is introduced to the Bey as Isabella's uncle. And that's the basic setup. The Bey, fed up with his wife Elvira and about to be besotted with Isabella. Lindoro, his slave, supposed to marry Elvira and be sent back to Italy. Isabella determined to dump Taddeo, fool the Bey, and rescue Lindoro. And as an amiable afterthought, she decides to restore Elvira to the arms of her husband. And all this, I'm sorry to spoil the end, she achieves. As it's a comic opera, though, there's the inevitable manoeuvring and fast-paced duets and a wonderful quintet in the second act. And I won't go through it all because it will be perfectly obvious in performance and will follow its own joyous logic. But you might like to take on board how it works. Clearly, the allies have got to get together, rather like the marriage of Figaro. They've all got to gang up against the bloke who's notionally in control. So they gang up against the bay, but like the Marriage of Figaro, they've got to do it with a certain amount of caution. And of course, the lovers have to meet. And that happens in one of the loveliest parts of the opera. One of Rossini's strokes of genius in this show was to slightly mix comic and serious genre. You heard it really in that opening aria with that rather magnificent and quite stately opening to a cavatina, and yet, we were going to go into the comic fast colorature afterwards. And in the recognition scene, you get what you need in a comic opera, which is breathing, space, real emotion, just like you need the tenor to convince you he's serious. Somewhere embedded in the heart of a show, you need a moment of emotional sincerity. Even Pirates of Penzance, you have to believe that Frederick and Mabel love each other. And then you get that little quiet moment at the beginning back too. It's that sort of little valve in an opera that stops it becoming tinny and too fast-paced and getting out of control. And in Italiana, the recognition scene happens in the middle of the big finale. Again, this is another part of the show you set your watch to. You expected the big finale. In fact, it's a very, very nice moment, the finale. You think, oh, good, 2/3 of the way through. Now everything that could have happened has happened, and everything that could have gone wrong has gone wrong, and they'll just have to sort it out and work it out in Act 3, and we'll get to the happy ending, or whatever. And so this is a moment where everybody eventually gets onto stage. There's a revelation, there's a shudder of surprise, everyone freezes and pours out their feelings, and then they swing into normal life with a fast-paced number to bring down the curtain. So that's an Italian finale. And a very clever bit of dramaturgy too, because in those days the lighting was very poor, and obviously the candles and oil lamps, but the theatres got too big for the lighting facilities. So suddenly Italians were faced with quite dimly lit theatres, and their gesturing became quite rhetoric, in fact large. And one way to keep the audience's attention was to do the big, large gesture, but also another way was to just stop, just freeze, create a tableau on stage. And in doing this, the Italians were particularly helped by what appears to be the national temperament, because when this sort of thing happened in England, people would watch the Italians apparently freeze. But they'd all say, such is the national vivacity and energy of an Italian. You don't think they're freezing at all. You think they're about to pounce. And as I'm sure you can guess, singing quietly on stage or standing still on stage is an extraordinarily difficult art. And it has to have that inside energy so the audience doesn't nod off. So these frozen moments can be very, very interesting and exciting and give pace, of course, to the finale. In this opera, the finale, people are coming on stage. Lindoro's about to go off with Elvira. He's apparently going to marry her. He's going to go back to Italy. He hasn't met Isabella yet, as you'll have gathered. Isabella has just seen the bay, and there's a really rather marvellous recognition scene where she sort of takes him in and then ends up with the face. Oh, my God. Worse than I thought, awful moment. And then as Lindoro comes in, the lovers see each other. And perhaps David Parry will correct me, but the moment seems almost Mozartian, really. It's just a moment of poignancy, quiet, tension, as the lovers recognise each other and in some way claim each other again. As soon as Isabella realises that Lindoro's here, she recovers herself, insists that Elvira stays in Algiers. She's not going to have anything to do with a man who's treating his wife so badly, and she needs an Italian slave. For example, that nice young man over there who sings tenor. And the Bey is so overcome that he agrees. He's completely fallen for her. He's utterly besotted. He doesn't act particularly sensibly all opera, but he acts particularly foolishly after he's met Isabella. And so he said, yeah, sure. The announcement delights everyone, and they all go delirious, as Rossini ends the act in high old-fashioned with one of his completely bonkers endings. Quite often with Rossini, this might indicate a change in the weather or something like that. It certainly seems to do so in Barbara Seville. Here, it just goes into nonsense. It's full of sounds. There's bell sounds. The women sing din, din, din. There's a hammer. It's very difficult to give you an adequate idea of the subtlety of this piece. There's a hammer that's going tack, tack, tack. Something that sounds like a crow from Taddeo, cra, cra, cra. And a cannon, boom, 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 from the bay. So much edified by this subtle and intelligent way to finish an act, you go off and have a gin and tonic.
And believe me, it's very fast.
Is it?
It's that last bit. Yeah.
Go on, show us. No.
It's
Could
something
you?
like...
I didn't want to put him on the spot.
That's the quintet.
Sorry?
That's the quintet.
Oh, that's it. Oh, so...
Still the quintet.
Ah, yes.
Fantastic.
I got it eventually.
Yeah. The worst thing you can do a repetiteur is ask him to do something because his little sticky notes are never at the right bits, are they? No. Okay. Anyway, Act 2 concerns itself with Isabella's escape. And she seems to get her master plan from the Bey's insistence that Taddeo be promoted to the position of Kaimakan, the protector of the Muslims. Taddeo finds the idea and the appallingly uncomfortable costume awful. But as soon as you obstruct the Bey, he immediately says, all right, I'll impale you now. He sort of naturally, he agrees. Isabella goes one step forward and offers to bestow on the Bey the Order of the Papatacci, an invention of her own, of course. He's given this honour after he's been thoroughly frustrated. I mean, he's in such a state by the end of Act 2, he's going to agree to anything, really. Isabella has a great scene where she gets dressed, ready to have coffee with the Bey, knowing very well that the Bey is hiding and watching her, and Taddeo is watching her, and Lindoro is watching her. And she sings a song, apparently full of ardour. For who? All the men take it as addressed to them. The Bey naturally thinks it's addressed to him. Lindoro knows it's addressed to him. And at the subsequent coffee party, the Bey can't get her alone. She asks Elvira to join them, and then Lindoro. And that, of course, produces the quintet, as you've heard bits of already. And after the quintet, the Bey will do anything. So Isabella explains that the Papatacci are an exclusive order who spend their lives eating, drinking and sleeping. And they show their resolution by never commenting on whatever bizarre events they witness. At which point cue the Papatacci trio for the Bey, Taddeo and Lindoro, one of the great moments of the show, and which sometimes gets an encore. No. Don't even try, don't even think about it. Anyway, Isabella, aware that she's got the Bey agreeing to become a Papatacci, rallies the Bey's Italian slaves with her great recitative and rondo, Pensa alla Patria, another wonderful mixture of opera seria, grandeur, and opera buffo, brilliance. This is the last great set piece of the show. We're not going to hear the recitative, we're going to hear the rondo, Pensa alla Patria, and it's supposed to be interrupted with choruses of slaves and stuff, but I don't think we can ask Nicholas.
No, I think my voice is reserved for the rehearsals.
Okay.
So I've made a few cuts.
Oh, okay. But you must imagine the slaves going, yeah, great, yes, let's do that, great, you know. Anyway, Pensa alla Patria by Sarah. Thank you. So now it's just a question of wrapping up the show. The Bey's capacity to remain silent is greatly tested when he sees all his Italian slaves, Lindoro and Isabella, on board a ship, bound for Italy. And when at last he realises what is happening, he's told by Taddeo, the rat, it's all too late. And the Bey recognises that Italian girls are too clever for him. He begs forgiveness of his wife, gives the lovers his blessing, and leads the company in wishing them a safe journey home. Phew. And this is, in a way, where I should end. But actually, I'd like, apart from wanting to talk very much to David and fielding your questions and things, I was astonished. In my other life, I do stuff about theology and stuff, and I was reading James Allison, who's a very, very fine American and English theologian. He works in America. And he wrote about his great debt to an Italian composer. And he said this: he was a man who consistently showed signs of actually liking being human and finding the human condition funny, tender, and not needing the stimulant of deep tragedy or great drama. Great thought is not of itself much given to facilitating tenderness of heart or gentle and pointless frivolity, and it's been given to me to start learning these lessons, vital complements to any other, from that vastly underrated maestro, Gioacchino Rossini. And I actually think that is completely true. Rossini is a great comic composer. He's a great and brilliant musician, but he's also somebody that has the integrity to give you a sense of blessedness once you've seen one of his shows. And I'm sure, and I hope, that you'll get that at Garsington. Thank you. I knew you wanted to cut. And takes centre stage.
Oh,
of
my
course.
goodness.
Yes, of course.
I think I've been given a mic. I'm not sure I need a microphone. Do I need a microphone?
No.
No, don't switch it on. That'll shatter the chandeliers, possibly.
I mean, this obviously stuff you can tell us without me asking questions, but so many actors tell me that acting comedy is much more difficult than acting tragedy. Is this in any way relevant to you conducting Rossini?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, I think the reason that one would say that is that you have to. If you try to make things funny, they never are.
Yeah, true.
And actually, that applies to how you conduct. I mean, if you try to sort of trivialize it, then it's not going to have a deeply comic effect. So that is the technical difficulty of performing comedy in general. I mean, actors as well. And after all, we are singing actors on the stage. And in some ways, it's easier, I think, for singers because they have the technical requirements. They have to sing. They have to be able to sing the thing. And there's a kind of discipline involved in singing, which means that you're less likely to push your personality and have a kind of try and make comic effects. You actually just do the thing, and then it's funny. And in the end, when we're talking to the directors and when we talk about this, it's always the question of, we must make this real and then it'll be funny. Mm. And actually, you said something quite interesting about the Mustafa the Bey, who you said is the buffo bass. But actually, if it's played as a buffo bass, it's not funny. It's actually tiresome. And, we've seen so many tiresome performances. That's one of the things that, and certainly when we've done comic operas in recent years at Garsington, particularly Rossini, we've shied away from that kind of casting. And actually, we've cast, as I'm sure many of you saw, Talk in Italia. It's the same artist, Corinne Delang, who performed Céline, which is the similar part. It was actually written for the same singer, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. And he is not a classic buffo at all. He's actually extremely handsome, very sexy, quite young, and able to act dangerous without trying. And I think this, to me, in Italiana, it's much more interesting if he's actually a possible lover. Mm. If he's not a possible lover, what's it about, really, in the end? If he's just ridiculous, it's too easy. And actually, she could say, wow, he's a dish, I'll go with him. But she doesn't, because she's truthful to her love. And this is very much a Rossini theme, isn't it? So you get it in Barbiere, when the Count disguises himself so that he will know that he's loved for himself, not for his money and for his situation. Right, yes. So this whole thing of trying to find, it's a kind of early romantic ideal, really, isn't it? Finding love, which is true love, and not based on a social need or whatever. And actually, that is voiced in the opera. I mean, Mustafa says to Lindor, well, what do you want? I mean, don't you know somebody pretty with plenty of money, and we'll give you money, or you can have somebody pretty. She's lovely, his wife, because he wants to get rid of her. What's the problem? He says, well, actually, it's for love. And he says, what on earth is that about? In Italy, you do that? I suppose Italians like that kind of thing. It's quite interesting, really. Yes. But he, of course, is interested in her for sexual reasons, yes. Obviously. Yes. And so he is much more, Mustafa is much more in a line. He's much more single-minded than anybody else in the opera. And that's why he's fooled, because he's single-minded, so all he's thinking about is getting Isabella into bed, and he doesn't notice all the other things that are going on around him.
All the stuff in the wings actually passes him by.
But it's not because he's a stupid person, it's because he's obsessed. Yes. That's the point, yeah.
And given, like all Italian operas, it is voice-driven, and yet, to my ear, there's lots of interesting things going on in the pit. Can you talk about that?
Yes. Well, I think that's the thing that Rossini obviously went much further. you said, and it's quite interesting, you said this is also true, that it's based on, or it's an extension of existing models, existing compositional models.
Yes,
but I've done operas, or excerpts, actually I've even done operas, earlier composers who, like Cimarosa and Paisiello, and what's his name, the German, Meyer.
Oh, Meyer, yes.
Yeah. And you see that where Rossini came from, but you also see that he immediately made it much more complex and coloured and interesting, you know, and it's so fascinating. And to think, 3 weeks, he wrote this thing in 3 or 4 weeks, it's absolutely extraordinary. The man was an extraordinary composer. And it annoys me like it annoys the hell out of you as well. This thing about, he was lazy, this, that, no. He can't possibly have been lazy. The amount of work that's involved in doing it is incredible. And we know that he had a relatively short career, but he wrote however many operas it was, 35 or whatever.
Yeah, but he stopped at 37, which is a dangerous age for a composer, isn't it?
Yeah.
Bizet, Mozart,
Exactly,
Purcell,
but at least he didn't die.
No, exactly.
But I think he burnt out, really. I
Yes.
think he burnt out because, he'd been working so hard that, it's not that he couldn't write music anymore, he just couldn't stand the pace, I think.
Yes.
And that's our loss in a way. But, on the other hand, we have these great operas. The other thing I wanted to say, which you brought up, about him being a comic genius, I think that's only half of the story, if I may say so.
Indeed.
And, of course, many of you, I'm sure, have seen Maometto II at Garsington, which is very far from being a comic opera. And I'm just conducting at the moment Hermione in Germany, which is the first stage production of Hermione in Germany, amazingly. So this amazing opera is written in 1819, having its German premiere in 2016. It's kind of fantastic. And these operas are really major, serious works. There's an enormous emotional range behind the comic operas, which is why they live in the way they do. And every single one of them has a different atmosphere, a different idea behind it, doesn't it? If you think of the difference between Barbiere, Italiana, Cenerentola, how different they are. All that's the same is the forms. The forms are the same in all the operas, although he begins to break them in the serious operas, actually. But, they start to break down. It
can be a little disconcerting hearing his serious operas, because you recognise a form from a
Yes.
comic opera, and then you have to adjust yourself.
Yes, but it is only a form.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the point.
Yeah.
It's the energy level is the thing which you get always, isn't it, with Rossini? This amazing high-octane stuff, which is his kind of... It's like sort of... It's just normal writing for him, And to think that this therefore has to be comic because it's high energy, to me, is not right.
And so on the podium,
yes.
this energy is somehow you've got to get it through.
Yes, if you don't have energy, don't conduct Rossini, I'll tell you that. And if you haven't got stamina, don't do it either. Really.
Forget the Wagner. Yeah.
Yes, I did Maometto II, of course, we did it at Garsington, and we had an hour and a half interval in the middle. And then I did it in concert in Germany, and they said, a 15-minute interval. And we tried doing it in a rehearsal with a 15-minute interval. And I said, I'm terribly sorry, this has to be a half an hour's interval, because I'm going to die otherwise in Act 2. Because Act 2 is an hour and a half long, practically, with the same incredible intensity, It's much more difficult than conducting Wagner, I'll say that for it.
Ha! Thought as much.
I've done that too, I know.
Thought as much.
I stood up all the way through Flying Dutchman, done in one act, and really it's nothing like as tiring as doing Maometto II.
Oh, I remember that. And Sarah was saying about stylistic things, about throwing in notes and stuff. Are you? I thought Rossini actually hated all that.
No, I don't think he. I think he hated it when he couldn't control it himself. I'm absolutely sure he expected variations to be made.
Okay.
Obviously, he wouldn't expect it to be done, but they were written, these pieces, and he controlled the performances. He was absolutely in control of the performances. And the interesting thing is that originally, of course, nobody imagined this music was, least of all him, when it was first written, it was going to last for so long. And he was surprised and amazed towards the end of his life at the comic operas that lasted so long. And the first thing he said about something maybe happening, the works continuing, was indeed Hermione, which was a big failure at its premiere, and indeed wasn't performed after 1819 until about 1970 or something. And he said, somebody said to him after a bit, when he was in Paris, why don't you revive Hermione? And he said, no, this is music for the future. Oh. I know, it's very interesting because it's a sort of the beginning of the idea that music might last.
Yes, yes.
Rather than just be performed and then discarded and you have a new piece. Because what we have to remember is that in the early 19th century, still practically everything that was performed was new. Yeah. You know, it's absolutely different from now. Yeah. And this whole sort of development of music being preserved and performed only started actually at the beginning of the 19th century, really.
Yeah, I
and Mozart and Bach were revived. Yes. Well, Mozart sort of continued in one or two pieces continued. Bach was revived by Mendelssohn. And that was kind of the beginning of establishing a repertoire that goes on. And now, of course, we have the reverse situation. Practically nothing we hear is new, which is also, in its way, unhealthy, isn't it?
I agree with you, yes.
Yes.
I wonder if anybody has any questions to ask David or Sarah, if you'd come forward. Why don't we bring a chair forward?
Oh, you've been singing, you better sit down.
Yeah, you better sit down. David, come on.
Oh, no, I don't need to sit down.
You've got all that.
I don't need to sit down.
You don't? All right, let's stand here. Oh, look, there's somebody
look
there.
at the chair.
Hello, yes.
You mentioned, I found this quite intriguing, it's not necessarily specific to the opera that you talked about, but you mentioned the recitative
Yeah.
that exists in the opera still at that stage. And I was just wondering, how does that fit in? Why does it have to fit in? Why did it still have to be there?
This is a question about, I'm just better say this for the film, that someone's asking about recitative and why is it still got to be there?
Well, I mean, the thing about operas in this period is that they play with the sense of time the whole time. So the recitative sections are basically like dialogue. So it's at natural speed. So it's continuing the action, and then you change it changes the sense of time when something's sung. On the whole, it changes the sense of time. In other words, it becomes, as you mentioned, frozen moments. But it's not just a frozen moment. There are, it's elastic, the sense of time. And this is something which we've come to accept. We accept much better now than perhaps we did in the, 50 years ago, when kind of so-called naturalism took hold, and the idea, as you get in Puccini and so on, that actually it's all taking place in more or less natural time. This is, of course, it's nonsense to talk about naturalism in opera because people don't sing in real life. They speak.
I do.
I was just thinking that.
So the answer to your question is that it's basically like a play, but it's a play which changes the sense of time the whole time because it uses music, and this is exaggerated by the use of recitative, which is absolutely like normal conversation in pace. In the case of comic operas, certainly. I mean, also it's interesting when you have a serious opera, then you get a much more declaimed recitative, which is more like if you were doing a great French tragedy of Racine or Corneille. I mean, it has that sort of grandeur about it, so it begins to match the pacing of the music more. But the important thing is we have to realise that this is not natural time. It's constantly changing. It's constantly being messed with by the composer, which is what makes it so interesting, of course.
Fantastic. Gentlemen, yes?
You mentioned that in the finale, before we all go off for our G&Ts,
yeah,
amazing aria with those incredible sounds, weird and wonderful sounds. And I was wondering whether that's unique to Rossini's oeuvre, because I can't think of any other finales which have those sorts of
other finales
weird and wonderful sounds.
Other finales with nonsense sounds.
Well, Barbara Seville's good. It's a bit nonsensical, isn't it?
It's getting a bit bonkers.
I mean, I think he uses something which so it becomes absolutely unnaturalistic. It becomes completely bonkers, crazy, because the people are going crazy, because the situation is so extreme, and they can't deal with it. So it's heightened. It's heightened by using, in this case, using absolutely nonsense words. But often, it's repeated over and over a phrase, and it's actually the kind of musical extremity takes over. It's a very extreme moment. The stretta, the Act 1 finale, in this and many of the other operas, it's called the stretta because it's pushed. It's you're rushing on ahead. They come out of, if you think of the Act 2 finale of Marriage to Figaro or the Act 1 finale of Così fan tutte, it's the same thing but not so extreme. Rossini makes it much, much, much more extreme, I'd say.
Good luck with it.
Oh, don't worry, we can do it.
Could I just ask one question to you? Is it fun?
Of course.
It is.
There are different stages, and they're all sort of fun in different ways. Like when you get a new role that you've never seen before, just getting the score and opening it up and seeing what's in there is quite fun. And then learning the notes is arguably fun or not fun, depending on the day. And then I always find rehearsal to be quite fun. I really enjoy rehearsals.
Okay.
And then performing is something different because you can just go, yes, I think it's fun.
Yeah.
Yes. I think you have to think it's fun or it would be a completely mad career.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure that everybody will want to join me. Hello, everybody. I'm Nikki Creed, Executive Director, for those of you who don't know me. And it's lovely to see so many of you here today. And I'm sure you'll want to join me in thanking everybody here. Sarah Byrne, Sarah Champion, Nick Bosworth and David Parry, and also very much to Sir Vernon and Lady Ellis for allowing us to be here in your wonderful house. But it's been a wonderfully interesting talk. Thank you so much, Sarah, and I'm sure we're all longing to see it. We've had our wonderful first rehearsal when all the cast comes together and you've got that fizz and excitement in the room. So I certainly can't wait to see it. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.